In a similar vein to the video in which I expressed my discontent with the way they craft comic book television shows, where, I essentially summarized it as most of them are just a soap opera reskinned with whatever the themes are and the characters are from a particular comic book franchise or series. And so as a result, felt quite unsatisfying and fairly hollow, and didn't actually attempt any of the goals or aims of what the medium of comic books try to or potentially can express in terms of stories. And much of the significance was lost from those properties, actually, even though seemingly they'd been tried within the TV medium. Well, likewise, I've actually found ultimately the genre of comic book movies to be pretty underwhelming. I'm someone who should have been primed to be the target audience for these films in the old sense. Because when I was growing up, and I was someone who's very much loved comic books, especially particular characters, I used to watch every single thing I could get my hands on in terms of comic books. If they did a TV show, Lois and Clark, as it was called in America. In the UK, it was called Superman, New Adventures of Superman. Used to watch all of these, even if they were really just like a soap opera to some degree, but there was like half and half. Used to watch all the movies that were done on TV. Famously, those Incredible Hulk movies that really weren't huge movies, and so as a result, like Return of the Incredible Hulk, etc., they were just shown famously in the UK as like reruns on like Saturday afternoons or during holidays or on a bank holiday when they just had to fill some time. They'd pop one of them at like 4 in the afternoon. Used to watch all this stuff, and at the time I understood that these movies very much couldn't be massive cultural successes. There weren't that many people interested, and as a result, they weren't going to put in massive amounts of resources and give great budgets and have the best actors in them and the biggest directors and all the weight of the filmmaking industry behind them to potentially let them be the great films of all time. I kind of understood that, and so I just took what I could get at the time. And obviously also when I was a child, I didn't have the same degree of aesthetic taste, etc., to appreciate what a great movie was. And so I could put up with more simplistic entertainment in those respects. And those people did what they could with what they were working with. But in an era when some of these movies now that are comic book movies have the biggest budgets in the world, some of them have massive amounts of resources thrown behind them, years of planning, like a whole trajectory and vision behind where they're supposed to end up. These are massive comic book companies now and massive movie studios working on these franchises, bringing in big actors, but sometimes getting big directors. You'd think we'd have more classics. We had the odd one in the early days, like the first Superman films in the late 70s, early 80s. We had the Batman movies of Tim Burton, and then we got to eventually the X-Men movies came around. But this is all before this era of the comic book movie being so prevalent, so ubiquitous within culture, and yet so few of them actually being anywhere close to great movies. Many of them just being average to good, and some of them flat out being bad. So it is just underwhelming to me when you consider the material they're working and what you could do with it. One of the first areas which I have to bring up as to why it's so underwhelming is this trend of just telling the origin story of the character over and over and over. Because if you think about anyone who reads the comic connected to that character, 99% of people reading that comic have never read the original origin story. Because when Superman's origin story happened in Action Comics, 90 years ago or something, no one's around from back then. No one goes and rereads that reprint if it's brought out. It's not vaguely relevant now, but everyone in culture knows the vague origin story of Superman, and even people who go see the movies know the origin story. For a start, it's been in so many movies. Same for Spider-Man, same for most of the X-Men characters. You don't need to retell the origin over and over again, and yet, especially because they reboot these series over and over again. I could almost understand when the property changed from one movie studio to another, like where Fox lost some of them and it went over to another one. I could almost understand there if they want to start from the beginning, but this rebooting, especially like the idea we're doing another Spider-Man movie starting again at the beginning, because in those comics, there's hundreds of stories, there's thousands of individual stories, there's hundreds of arcs, there's so many writers, so many people have come in and be involved with the comic, that the best stories, the most interesting things about those characters aren't in the origin story. And that's the problem. They'll spend a whole first movie wasted on retelling this origin story instead of telling a different story, instead of telling a new story, or instead of telling one of the best stories, because the best arcs, the best stories of most characters in comic books are not the origin period. It's very rare that it is. I mean, this is why I could almost forgive the idea of what they're trying to do apparently with this new Spider-Man movie, which is that at least supposedly they're trying to harken back to the Stan Lee Ditko era of Spider-Man, where admittedly Spider-Man's one of the few ones where the origin story of Spider-Man, as told by Steve Ditko and Stan Lee, was very good. That was very iconic and almost did deserve to play out. But many of the other characters do not. Like, the X-Men origin stories are quite crap, ultimately. Superman's origin story is not very interesting, not least because a lot of people don't know this. His origin story changed so many times over the years, and the little details of the mythos were woven in that there never was one origin story like that encapsulated what Superman is. You find out what Superman is either through culture, and he's pretty prevalent as a character. He's one of the most famous symbols in the world. You kind of know the basics. Or you find out through having read comics or encountered other media that involve them. So you don't need to retell it, and it just makes for boring movies when you know what's going to be the main plot line again and again and again. Also, I have to add in, yes, people are going to think to themselves who are naive and don't know anything about modern comics and maybe haven't seen some of the better comic movies. When I say this next point, they're going to think, well, is how it should be, right? But I despise the trend that there has to be a childish humor level to these movies. Now, people, again, as I referenced there, are going to think, well, these are for kids, this is like kids medium. No, that's the whole point. The reason why it's huge now is it isn't. And actually, comics haven't been like that for the last 30 years. I'd imagine the average reader of comics over the last 20 to 30 years was probably over the age of 20. Like, this isn't something where you're trying to get to the 12-year-old or 13-year-old kid who has a very juvenile, adolescent sense of humor. Now, I understand this could be a whole video in itself. A lot of Western culture, particularly in America, does have a very simplistic, lowest common denominator level of humor that is fairly simple in that respect. I understand that. But my point is, even though this trope has been famously present in action movies in Hollywood, I think it limits some of the bigger titles. Like, there's certain characters where it's relevant, where you can do that, where it's fine to do that with the story, it fits them, but you don't really need to do it in characters like Superman, like Batman, like X-Men to some degree, unless it's a certain character with an X-Men like a Gambit, etc. It doesn't fit the tone, and it doesn't allow you to properly set up the atmosphere, the tension of a really big story, and show that this is a serious movie. Yeah, the characters come from a childish medium of entertainment many, many years ago, but they've been refined, the process has been refined. We're trying to tell something serious about a complex character and make a real movie, because if you take it on that childish level, it always limits how it can match up against one of the great movies, assuming we're not including comedies in that particular respect. Then you've got to look at the fact that they just continually, to this day, continue this track record of picking generic directors. They'll pick guys that you've never heard of before this movie, or who did one movie before. And famously, with a lot of comic book movies, they went and they got people who did music videos. So they found someone and thought, all right, he's fairly stylish. I like his visual style. He knows the basics of how to make a movie. Let's get this guy, have him make the movie. Now, part of the reason they did that, quite cynically, is because they thought they had the formula planned out for how to make a successful comic book movie. And part of that was they wanted to have a producer who understood this formula, and he would do lots of the movies, and then they would stick the producer on the movie, and he would essentially coach or mentor this young music video guy who, because it's his first big feature film, is going to do whatever that guy says, and therefore they're going to kind of ensure a level of what they'd call quality control, but actually it's not producing quality. It's keeping things very formulaic, sticking by the cookie cutter component that they think has worked before, and therefore never really doing anything ambitious or brave with the movie. And that's just been the approach they've taken in the past. Because the reason why it's sad that so many generic directors are involved is great artists, and obviously great movie directors, auteurs, are considered within that bracket, that umbrella. Great artists produce great vision. They have a singular vision or a way of interpreting what's happening, and then their artistry is the ability to communicate that to you, to express it. So we want guys that come in and they take the material, they consume it, they push it through themselves, and what comes out is something that's, yes, the original material, but also it's going to be unique to them, and the way they're going to express it is through their own artistic expression, their own medium, their own talents, and we're going to get something special because they're great artists. You just look at the best comic book movies of all time, and these pretty much, many of them were the ones where you let great directors come in and have a key role in shaping the narrative. So obviously, a lot of people hail the Christopher Nolan Batman movies. Christopher Nolan, one of the best directors of the last 20 years, and his attempts at them, particularly the second and third one, had incredible moments and were very daring and brave and bold with how they reinterpreted the world and what he did within it and the stories that he created that, took elements of other stories from Batman and its history, but did something totally fresh with them. I mean, obviously, people who enjoyed the first two Spider-Man movies will know Sam Raimi is someone who was considered a very serious director before that, who'd done a lot of legit movies. But not only were the Spider-Man movies, the first two, good, sometimes very good at times, and took the material in its own direction, but he also, as a comic book movie, had previously done Dead Man. And that's a movie that a lot of people probably haven't seen, but it's a good one. It's not as high budget, but it treats the topic very seriously, and it's an adult-themed movie, and it's got its own redeeming quality because it's got a good artist behind it. Obviously, Bryan Singer, with what he did with the first two of the X-Men movies and what he did with Days of Future Past, these are some of the best comic book movies we've ever seen. In fact, I think Days of Future Past and X-Men 2 are some of the best movies ever made. They can go up there with any movie head to head, and they don't have to stay within the bracket of comic book genre. That's how seriously they treat it and how full on they are with the director and the actors, and they have a great movie as a result. Obviously, the early Batman movies of Tim Burton, yes, he did something very unique in terms of how he did it, and the aesthetics of it all fit his sensibilities, but there's a reason why these movies were some of the early great comic book movies, because you took material that could have been dealt with in a very formulaic, childish manner and gave it to a great artist. I'm not as big a fan of Tim Burton, but I certainly enjoy some of his movies and what he did there, and he produced something special that made it compelling, made it worth watching. Now, one of the other areas in which you can see how this process is worthwhile is, yes, not all of the movies you give to even great or good directors that are established are going to turn out great. But even the flawed ones tend to have redeeming qualities and parts about it that make it worthwhile because it was someone with a vision behind it. So, for example, Bryan Singer, he did a movie that wasn't particularly good. In fact, he did a couple of them. So he did Superman Returns, which was very flawed and had a lot of aspects that weren't as good, but it also had aspects where he really understood what the original Superman movies were about and was aping some of those aspects in a way that was very satisfying. Likewise, his most recent X-Men movie, the Dawn of Apocalypse or whatever it was called, Age of Apocalypse, I can't remember. This one, I mean, I don't think it was that good a movie. I think it was much worse than the one before. But you could see he was trying to do something. He was trying to do something ambitious, even though he didn't pull it off. The Hulk has been rebooted a bunch of times, but Ang Lee is a very serious movie director. And what he did with his, it wasn't a fantastic Hulk movie, but it was a very interesting movie. I mean, it certainly took it in a weird direction that you wouldn't have expected and did something different with the character. And even for Christopher Nolan's, how much he's hailed as some genius, which I think he is fantastic, I think his first Batman movie wasn't that good at all compared to the others. Batman Begins is a very average movie. Even among superhero movies, it's just average to good. But you can see how those were the teething problems, the growing pains of what he was trying to figure out to do with that world and how to express that character, which he then nailed in the next movie, in The Dark Knight. So I want to see the Aronofskys, the Villeneuves, the Danny Boyles of the world make these movies so that they'll take their artistic sensibilities and apply it to these movies and do something different with them. And then we'll be getting truly great movies that happen to be comic book movies, not comic book movies that within the confines of what a comic book movie can and is allowed to be is good. That's not a good standard to live by. Then you've got to add in one of the most underwhelming aspects. When I said before that they just tell the origin story over and over again, as I said, the origin story is very rarely ever the best story arc to tell for a character. Why don't they ever take the great arcs from comics and make those a movie about those? I mean, there's obvious ones out there. Like a really great one you could take would be from Grant Morrison's JLA run called Rock of Ages, about the villain Darkseid. Now, this is an incredibly ambitious story that takes a bunch of characters all over different universes and time frames and is very bold in terms of what it does. And it's so universe-shattering almost in terms of what it attempts, but it's so fantastic as a result. And it's like nothing else you've ever read. And as a result, as a movie experience, if they pulled it off with the proper budget and director and actors, this could be like one of the best movies ever made. Never mind just one of the best comic book movies or a good movie. Yet they don't take these great story arcs. The story arcs are already out there, sitting there. There are tons of great comic writers that made amazing arcs that have never been used in movies. Now, they'll often take them and steal elements of them or a tiny tweak from them like they did with the Mark Millar's Ultimates run, which they took some of that and made it into what Iron Man and Avengers came. And they took some of the spirit of it, but they never take any of the arcs. And yet they're willing to tell the same shitty origin story over and over again 50 million times when everyone knows it. I mean, I will say that Marvel have started somewhat to change some of this in terms of, and I mean Marvel, the comic books, not necessarily in terms of who's producing the films, in as much as, yeah, the X-Men films now, we have had the Days of Future Past played out, and we have had the Avengers is taking on some elements of these. They are starting to do that with some of the titles, but it's still far too dry on the ground in this particular sense of not taking the good arcs and doing something with them when they already exist. You don't have to rewrite a whole script for it in that sense. They also waste their time on shit like making a Green Lantern movie, which was never that great a character, and I don't think it has the same compelling following as some of the others. And they didn't clearly, if you look at that movie, have a good notion of what to do with him or what story to tell, but just doing it and hoping somehow, throw shit at the wall, hope that'll work. When you've got fantastic titles out there, some of which, I mean, admittedly, some of these are creator-owned, some of which would be incredible to watch as a full-on movie, and have been hailed as fantastic and very successful comics, and they've never even attempted on TV, on movies. Like The Authority, one of the best team books you'll ever read. Transmetropolitan, one of the fantastic creator-owned stories, which, by the way, isn't a superhero story at all, and as a result could have even more of a serious real-world pull to it, and would be incredible, and could obviously have a long run of movies. Admittedly, these kinds of properties are starting to find themselves, with Preacher and Constantine and stuff, in TV shows. But as you already know from my other video, I'm not a big fan of how they interpret a lot of those. And again, because they're TV shows, unfortunately, not a lot of them are going to get the proper resources. They're not going to get the Westworld, Game of Thrones type budget and actors. They're going to get a smaller one, and it's going to be a lot more disposable, unfortunately. And you're going to have hit or miss stuff like Daredevil, where people like aspects of it, but it's never going to reach out and try and tell the big stories, is it? I also think, to touch into what I said about the childish level of humour, separate out these movies into genres. Don't just treat them all like every comic movie has to have these certain action beats, and there's a certain element of comedy in it, and the wisecracking, when it doesn't fit the characters. Like, it's one thing, okay, if you leave the Avengers, particularly the Tony Stark character, and you leave Kick-Ass, and you leave Spider-Man, and these movies are in the comedy genre with action elements. Yes, that's understandable because those are characters that fits the tone of, or you could even use them in that particular manner if they hadn't have been before. But leave the other ones to be serious movies. Attempt an epic scale when it's a big story, an important character, a serious character. Yeah, I understand that on one level, it is hard to criticize some of these companies who are making the films because they're just trying to make successful films. And I will say, the precedent was set long ago by the comic books companies, where they have been very controlling over their big properties, and they don't always want them to be taken in certain directions, and they do limit creativity in that respect and experimentation, because they treat them like properties, especially in the movie era, where they want them to build up into certain stories that they hope they can sell on to be made into movies. But just as within comics, when you get a really fantastic writer like a Grant Morrison, like an Alan Moore, these sorts of guys, they will give you a lot of leeway, and they will let you recreate elements of the character and take totally new directions with the character and kill off characters, just as they do that with comic books, because those guys are so fantastic that they can sell the comic. Likewise, the great director can sell the movie, and you should give him some more room, and you should try and get those guys more involved, because they're the guys who are going to take your franchises to the top of what movies can be. Then you got to add in that even when people talk about great comic book movies, they just stick to the same names over and over again. And they forget some of the great ones that actually don't necessarily get brought up so much. Like Kick-Ass is a fantastic movie. It's a funny movie. It's a really an original tone. Blade, people forget that's even from a comic. That's one of the best action movies ever. And that's a comic book movie. It's from the 90s. Then you've got X2, the second X-Men movie. In its own right, that's an awesome movie. So I feel like this is still an area, despite its success, that it has gotten in a cul-de-sac of what those movies can be. They're still not attracting the same level of quality to be making these movies that Hollywood could put on them otherwise. I mean, the idea that Raymond Chandler movies in the 1950s and 1940s get incredible actors and really great directors, but we can't have that for comic book movies now. It just seems like there's some disconnect there, and that they're stuck still thinking they have to appeal to a 12-year-old moviegoer. You can have great movies. At the moment, we're not getting them for comic book movies, though.